The next gland we will cover is the adrenal glands. They're also called the suprarenal glands because they're located above the kidneys. So here are the kidneys. When you hear the word renal, that refers to kidneys, and then supra means above. The important thing about the adrenal glands is they help regulate your stress. Now, if you look at the histology of the adrenal gland, you'll actually notice two very different types of structures in cells. Up here on top, take a look at the cell structure, kind of nice and squarish. And then down at the bottom, take a look at the cells here. They look very different in shape. And these two different parts have different structures, and therefore we name them according to the different regions. The whole top region, about the top 2/3 that's shown here, is called the adrenal cortex. And remember, cortex is the superficial or the external portion. So the adrenal cortex goes all the way around, which almost looks like a triangle hat. So all along the outside, the outer 2/3 layer. And the adrenal medulla is the inner 1/3 layer of the cells. You can think of medulla M in the middle. So the medulla is this part right here in the middle where you also see the blood vessels in red and blue. Now when we divide the adrenal gland into two regions based on the structure, it actually corresponds to the adrenal gland having two different functions, both still related with stress though. So let's look at the adrenal medulla, the one on the inside first. Adrenal medulla specializes in regulating your short-term stress. By short-term stress, I mean when you're in fight or flight. Right? We're talking about seconds, maybe a couple minutes at the most. So the adrenal medulla regulates short-term stress by releasing two main types of hormones. One called epinephrine, and the common name you'll recognize as adrenaline. And the other one is norepinephrine, which is noradrenaline. So you guys probably have heard of the term getting an adrenaline rush, right? Whether you are really nervous, you have this rush, or you're playing sports and you get the adrenaline rush, you might notice that's like a kick-in of energy. So what the norepinephrine and epinephrine do is they help activate your sympathetic nervous system response. Now think about the sympathetic nervous system. That's your fight or flight. Right? When you go into this mode, you start, for instance, running, you increase your heart rate, you increase your breathing, right? You don't digest. These behaviors are all due to the release of the adrenaline. And this adrenaline, the hormone, is released from the adrenal medulla. So you can see over here, here comes the nerve impulse from the brain, and ultimately it comes down here to the adrenal medulla, causing the adrenal medulla to release the epinephrine and norepinephrine, otherwise known as adrenaline. Now the adrenal cortex, on the other hand, the external part of the adrenal gland, regulates your long-term stress. So now we're talking weeks, months, years. In this scenario, the adrenal cortex releases three types of hormones. So we have aldosterone. Aldosterone's role is to help retain sodium and water in the blood. So it actually helps hydrate you. And that's important because if you're in long-term stress, you want to make sure that your body has enough fluids and that you retain your water. In long-term stress, the adrenal cortex also releases a hormone called cortisol. Cortisol helps with your metabolism. One thing it does that's really important is it actually helps maintain glucose or sugar levels really high in your brain. So that way your brain has enough energy to keep working even under stressful situations. Another interesting thing cortisol does is it actually suppresses your immune system. So you might notice that if you're under stress for a long period of time, you might start to get sick easier, for instance, like at the end of final exams. And that's because, again, cortisol inhibits your immune system. And the reason why it does that, it actually inhibits the inflammation, which is a response of your immune system. So the idea is that if you're under stress, you don't want any inflammation response. And you might recognize the word cortisone, which is actually in the same family of cortisol. That actually is an anti-inflammatory used for instance, joint injuries. And the last thing that the adrenal cortex will release during long-term stress is sex hormones. They're not exactly sure why, but it releases this sex hormone called DHEA, which is basically a precursor to testosterone and estrogen. Scientists are still researching, but they think that this DHEA might help counteract some of the effects of long-term stress and possibly even improving your mood. What they do know is that DHEA is present in early reproductive organ development, but the actual mechanism and function is still being discussed. So to summarize the adrenal glands, they consist of the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. Adrenal medulla releases epinephrine and norepinephrine for short-term stress response, and adrenal cortex releases aldosterone, cortisol, and sex hormones for long-term stress response.